North Africa, May 19th, 1943. The sand beneath Rüdiger von Weckmar's boots had turned to glass where the shell exploded. He couldn't feel his left leg anymore, only the wet warmth spreading through his uniform trousers, dark against the Afrika Korps tan. The sky above was impossibly blue, too beautiful for dying. Somewhere in the distance, a machine gun chattered its metallic staccato. Closer, much closer. Someone was screaming in German. It might have been him. He was 17 years old, and everything he'd been taught to believe was about to shatter like that sand. The American medics reached him before he finished bleeding out. They materialized out of the dust and smoke like ghosts in olive drab, their red crosses stark against the chaos. Rüdiger's vision was tunneling, the edges of the world going gray. But he could see their faces clearly. Young, scared, determined. One of them dropped to his knees beside Rüdiger, scissors already cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of his trousers. Another was shouting something in English, harsh syllables that meant nothing to the dying boy. The tourniquet bit into his thigh like teeth. The pain yanked him back to consciousness with such force that he gasped, sucking in air that tasted of cordite and copper. The American medic, he couldn't have been more than 19, freckled face streaming with sweat, was working with an intensity that seemed almost angry. His hands moved in practiced sequences, pressure on the wound, gauze packing, bandage wrapping. He wasn't gentle, but he was fast. "Easy, buddy," the medic said, though Rüdiger understood. "None of it. You're gonna be okay. You hear me? You're gonna be okay." This single fact, the speed, the urgency, the casual professionalism with which enemy soldiers stopped his death, would haunt him longer than the wound itself. In the German army, you waited. You waited for the sanitator to finish with officers. You waited while they triaged according to rank and usefulness. You waited because there were never enough medical supplies, never enough morphine, never enough time. And if you were a young Gefreiter with a mangled leg, you often waited until waiting no longer mattered. The Americans didn't wait. They didn't ask his rank. They didn't check whether he was worth saving. One of them, a kid from Iowa whose name Rüdiger would never learn, tied off the tourniquet while cracking jokes about baseball, a sport Rüdiger had never seen in a language he barely understood. But the tone was unmistakable. Casual, almost bored competence. Another jabbed morphine into his thigh with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he might have used to light a cigarette. The morphine hit like a warm wave. The pain receded, replaced by a floating sensation that was almost pleasant. Rüdiger watched the medics work on him as if from a great distance. They were the enemy. He'd been shooting at them, or at least at their side, just minutes ago. His training said they should leave him to die, or shoot him to save ammunition, or at best patch him up, just enough to interrogate him. Instead, they were saving his life with the same casual efficiency they might apply to one of their own. Within 20 minutes of the shell's impact, Rüdiger von Weckmar was on a stretcher, being carried toward an American aid station. Within 2 hours, he was in a field hospital. Within 4 hours, an American surgeon, a doctor from Philadelphia who'd left his practice to serve, who had a wife and 2 daughters waiting back home, was working to save the leg of an enemy soldier who'd just finished trying to kill Americans. He'd expected to die. Instead, he woke up with his leg saved and his certainties amputated. The field hospital was a collection of tents behind the lines, far enough from the front that you couldn't hear the artillery, but close enough that the convoys of wounded arrived in steady streams. Rüdiger drifted in and out of consciousness. For 3 days, his body fighting infection, while medics changed his bandages and pumped him full of sulfa drugs. When he finally surfaced into sustained wakefulness, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not total silence. There were voices, the clank of equipment, the distant rumble of trucks, but no screaming, No one begging for water. No death rattle of men drowning in their own blood. The field hospital was clean, organized, almost quiet. It smelled of disinfectant rather than gangrene. A nurse, an actual nurse, not a hastily trained orderly, came by with water and soup. She was African American, which shocked Rüdiger, almost as much as still being alive. In the propaganda, Americans were mongrels, a degraded race mixing of inferior peoples. Yet here was this woman in a pristine uniform, competent and professional, treating him with neither cruelty nor excessive kindness, just doing her job. "Can you sit up?" she asked in English. He stared at her blankly. She mimed the action, helped him into a half-sitting position, held the cup while he drank. The water was clean, cold. It tasted like a miracle. Over the next week, as his body began the slow work of healing, Rüdiger observed the American medical system with the bewildered fascination of an anthropologist discovering an alien civilization. Everything was abundant. Bandages were changed daily, sometimes twice daily. Medication was dispensed on schedule. Food arrived 3 times a day. Not good food, hospital food is never good, but sufficient, nutritious, regular. German wounded arrived at the same hospital, mixed with American casualties. Rüdiger watched to see if there would be a difference in treatment. There wasn't. The same doctors, the same nurses, the same standard of care. A German sergeant with a gut wound received surgery from the same team that operated on an American lieutenant with shrapnel in his chest. Both survived. This shouldn't have been possible. In Rüdiger's understanding of the world, you didn't waste resources on the enemy. Resources were scarce. Every bandage used on a German was one less for an American. Every hour of surgery was a choice. Yet the Americans seemed to operate on a different calculus entirely, one where medical care was simply what you did, regardless of uniform. Why? He asked a German-speaking orderly one day, a second-generation immigrant from Milwaukee who'd been drafted and found himself translating between wounded enemies. "Why do you save us?" The orderly shrugged. "Geneva Convention," he said. "Prisoners get medical care. It's the rule, but rules can be broken." "Not by us," the orderly said, as if this were obvious. "We're Americans. We follow the rules." This answer was more confusing than no answer at all. Berlin had been all flags and certainty when Rüdiger volunteered in 1940. He was 14 then, intoxicated by the newsreels of Rommel's lightning victories, by the neat rows of men in field gray, marching toward destiny. The world seemed clear then, divided neatly into us and them, right and wrong, civilization and chaos. Germany was rising from the humiliation of Versailles, reclaiming its rightful place in the world. The Führer spoke and millions believed. How could they not? Everything he'd predicted had come true. Austria reunited, the Sudetenland reclaimed, Poland crushed in weeks, France, proud France, defeated in 6 weeks. Young Rüdiger had devoured it all. The radio broadcasts, the newspaper stories, the mandatory Hitler youth meetings where they learned that they were the chosen generation, destined to build the 1,000-year Reich. His father, a diplomat from the old school, a man who'd served the Kaiser and then the Republic, who had learned to bite his tongue under the new regime, had said nothing when the boy announced his intention to enlist the moment he turned 17. What could he say? In 1940, in 1941, even in 1942, the 1,000-year Reich seemed to be winning. In those years, saying no to the Wehrmacht was saying no to history itself, was marking yourself as a defeatist, a traitor, someone who didn't believe in Germany's destiny. So Friedrich von Weckmar said nothing. He watched his youngest son memorize the catechisms of the new order, watched him practice marching in formation with other boys, watched him grow harder and more certain with each passing month. And he kept his doubts to himself, because doubt was dangerous, because they'd already taken so much, because he still had a wife and daughter to protect. By 17, Rüdiger had his wish. He shipped to North Africa in March 1941, part of the Afrika Korps reinforcement, after Rommel's early successes against the British. The desert was nothing like the propaganda. It was heat that made your brain swim, temperatures that reached 120 degrees in the shade. Except there was no shade. It was thirst that turned your tongue to leather, that made you dream about water, more than women, more than home, more than survival itself. It was watching men die from infected blisters because there was no medicine, while the British seemed to have an endless supply of everything. Watching dysentery hollow out entire companies. Watching fuel shortages strand panzers that could have broken the British lines if only they'd had petrol. Watching slowly as the early victories gave way to stalemate and then to creeping defeat. But there was also glory, or what passed for glory in the fevered logic of young men far from home. The camaraderie of shared suffering, the pride of serving under Rommel, the desert fox, the one German commander the British feared and respected. There were moments of victory. British positions overrun, supply depots captured, prisoners taken. Moments when it still seemed possible that they could win, that will and courage could overcome the grinding mathematics of logistics. Rommel himself had once driven past Rüdiger's position, standing in his command vehicle with his goggles pushed up on his forehead, scanning the horizon with binoculars. The boy had felt something like religious awe. Here was a man who understood war, not as bureaucracy, but as art, who moved troops like a chess master, who could see 3 moves ahead of his enemy. That this brilliant general was losing, slowly, inexorably, was a truth that took a long time to penetrate the armor of youth and propaganda. For 2 years Rüdiger fought, 2 years of advance and retreat, of victories that meant nothing because the British kept coming back, of watching the supply lines stretch and snap while the enemies grew stronger. 2 years of learning that wars aren't won by courage but by logistics, by the grinding arithmetic of who has more fuel, more food, more men, more steel, more everything. By late 1942, even the most fanatical among them knew the Desert War was lost. The Americans had landed in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel was trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army, pushing from the east, and American forces pushing from the west. The Afrika Korps was being strangled, slowly, methodically, by an enemy who had so much material abundance they could afford to be patient. Still, they fought on. Because that's what you did, because surrender was unthinkable, because to give up was to admit that everything, all the death, all the suffering, all the belief, had been for nothing, until for Rüdiger, it literally exploded in his face on that May morning, and thinking stopped being an option. The American POW camp was in Kansas. Kansas. Rüdiger had never heard of Kansas before he was sent there, packed into the hold of a transport ship, with 300 other prisoners, all of them expecting hell, and finding something far more disturbing. Normalcy. The journey itself had been instructive. They'd expected brutality, expected to be crammed into holds without ventilation, expected minimal food and water, expected casual cruelty from guards. What they got instead was military efficiency. The ship was crowded, but not dangerously so. They received 2 meals a day, not lavish but adequate. Guards maintained order without excessive force. There were rules clearly posted in German, and the rules were followed. It was boring. That was the most shocking thing. Captivity in American hands was boring, in the way that any well-run bureaucracy is boring. Forms were filled out. Names were recorded. Medical conditions were noted. They were processed like packages, with neither malice nor kindness, just procedure. The camp in Kansas appeared through the train windows on a scorching August day. Flat land stretching to the horizon. Fields of wheat rippling in the wind like golden seas. And then the camp itself. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire, guard towers at the corners. An American flag snapping in the constant prairie wind. It looked like what it was. Temporary housing, Functional, but not harsh. The barracks had been built quickly, you could tell, but they were solid. Each building housed 40 men in double-tier bunks with actual mattresses, thin, but mattresses nonetheless. There were windows, real windows with screens to keep out bugs. There were showers with hot water, though they were strictly scheduled. There was a latrine building that was cleaned daily. The camp itself was unremarkable. Exactly what the Geneva Convention specified for prisoner of war facilities. What shocked wasn't the accommodation, but its adequacy. The Americans, with their maddening literalism, actually followed the international treaties they'd signed. Rüdiger's first dinner in the camp was white bread, beef stew, canned peaches. He stared at the tray as if it were a hallucination. The portions weren't generous. This wasn't a hotel, but they were sufficient. More than sufficient. The bread was soft, not the sawdust-adulterated product that had become standard in Germany. The stew contained actual beef, chunks of meat he could identify, along with potatoes and carrots. The peaches were sweet, preserved in syrup, impossibly luxurious. For the past 6 months in Afrika, he'd been eating the same slimy canned meat day after day, supplemented by whatever could be scrounged from abandoned British positions. British hardtack, Italian tomato paste. Once, memorably, a case of South African jam that had somehow ended up in a captured truck. Before that, in Germany itself, rations had been tightening. His mother's letters, he'd received 3 in 2 years, spoke of shortages, of standing in line for bread, of making coffee from acorns because real coffee had vanished. And here, in a prisoner camp, in the middle of America's agricultural heartland, the enemy was serving beef. The psychological dissonance was immediate and profound. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. Defeat was supposed to be degrading. The Americans, according to the propaganda, were a weak people, softened by luxury, incapable of real sacrifice. Yet here they were, feeding their prisoners better than Germany was feeding its own soldiers in the field. "They're fattening us up before the slaughter," one of the older prisoners muttered that first night. A Feldwebel from Munich who'd been in since Poland. "They'll work us to death in their mines, or their factories. You'll see. The Americans are just better at hiding their cruelty." Others agreed. This had to be a trick, some elaborate deception. The real horror would reveal itself soon enough. They didn't see it. What they saw instead, day after day, week after week, was a system that operated with mechanical consistency. Wake at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work details, maintaining the camp, farming nearby fields, from 8 to noon, lunch. More work or free time, dinner at 5, lights out at 10. The work wasn't backbreaking. Farm labor mostly, which half of them had done before the war anyway. The Americans paid them in camp scrip, useless outside the wire but exchangeable for cigarettes, candy, writing paper. The guards were neither friendly nor hostile, professional, distant, bored. It was all so aggressively normal that it became its own form of psychological warfare. The re-education initiative began in November, 6 months after Rüdiger's arrival. An American colonel, a man named Herbert Patterson who taught history at Columbia before the war and spoke fluent German with a Berlin accent from his graduate studies, stood before an assembled group of 200 prisoners in the camp's largest recreation hall and explained the program in careful, precise German. "Gentlemen," he began, and that word itself was startling. Gentlemen. Not prisoners, not enemies, but gentlemen. The war is not over, but its outcome is no longer in doubt. Germany will lose. This is not propaganda. This is mathematics. We produce more steel, more oil, more aircraft, more ships. We will win because we can afford to lose battles and still win the war. You know this. You've seen it. The hall was silent. Some faces showed anger. Others showed resignation. A few showed the blank expression of men who'd stopped processing reality months ago. Patterson continued. "When the war ends, Germany will need to be rebuilt. Not just physically, that's the easy part, but politically, culturally, psychologically. You are young. Most of you are in your 20s. You will be the ones doing this rebuilding. The question is, what kind of Germany will you build? A German Germany, someone shouted from the back, not an American colony. Patterson nodded as if he'd expected this. Good. I don't want you to build an American Germany. I want you to build a democratic Germany. There's a difference. Democracy isn't American. It's a system of governance that can work anywhere if people understand its principles. We tried democracy, another voice called out, bitter and sharp. Weimar. It was chaos, inflation, unemployment, communists fighting fascists in the streets. The Führer saved us from that. Did he? Patterson's voice was mild, but his eyes were hard. You tried democracy for 14 years during very difficult circumstances. War reparations, economic depression, political extremism from all sides. It was messy and imperfect. And then you traded it for a system that promised order and strength and national glory. How did that work out? The silence was colder now. I'm not here to humiliate you, Patterson said. I'm here to offer you an opportunity. We're starting educational programs, journalism, printing, democratic governance, the principles of a free press. You can participate or not, it's voluntary. But if you choose to participate, you'll learn skills that will be valuable when you go home. More importantly, you'll learn to think critically about power, about government, about the relationship between citizens and their leaders. Why? The question came from Rüdiger, who hadn't planned to speak but found himself standing, the word escaping before he could stop it. Why teach us anything? Why not just keep us locked up until the war ends? Patterson turned to look at him directly. Because you're going home eventually. And when you do, Germany will need people who understand how democracy works. People who can build newspapers that tell the truth. People who can create political institutions that serve citizens rather than ruling them. People who've learned that questioning authority isn't treason, it's responsibility. The laughter was harsh, disbelieving. Democracy, question authority. These were the same words that had led to Weimar's chaos, to the political paralysis that had opened the door for the Führer's rise. But Rüdiger, sitting back down slowly, his rebuilt leg aching in the cold November air, didn't laugh. He thought about the American medics who'd saved him, about the doctors who'd operated on him with the same care they'd given their own wounded, about the guards who followed rules even when breaking them would have been easier, about 3 meals a day in a prisoner camp while Germany's own people were starving. He thought, what if everything I was taught was backwards? The thought was so dangerous, so potentially devastating, that he immediately tried to suppress it. But it lodged in his mind like shrapnel, impossible to remove without causing more damage. He signed up for the journalism course the next day. The instructor was a woman. This fact alone would have been scandalous in the Germany Rüdiger had left behind, where women were meant for Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. The 3 Ks that defined proper female existence. A woman teaching men, teaching politics, teaching anything beyond home economics or nursing would have been unthinkable. Margaret Chen was second-generation Chinese-American, 35 years old, a reporter for the Kansas City Star who'd volunteered to teach at the camp. She was unmarried, another scandal, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having been told she couldn't do something, or having been told so often that she'd stopped listening. She walked into the classroom, a converted barracks with chairs arranged in rows and a blackboard at the front, carrying a stack of newspapers and wearing a wool suit despite the heat. 23 German prisoners, ranging in age from 19 to 45, stared at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to confusion. Journalism, she said, her German accented but clear, is asking questions that powerful people don't want to answer. She let that statement hang in the air for a moment. That's it. That's the whole profession distilled to one sentence. Everything else,
The writing, the research, the interviewing, the editing, all of that is just technique. The essence of journalism is this. Someone powerful doesn't want you to know something, and your job is to find out what it is and tell everyone. The class was silent. In the Germany they'd left behind, asking questions of powerful people was how you ended up in a camp. Not a prisoner of war camp with 3 meals a day, but the other kind. The kind none of them spoke about, but all of them knew existed. The kind where asking questions got you killed. Margaret turned to the blackboard and wrote in large letters, who, what, when, where, why, how. These 6 words, she said, are more dangerous to tyranny than any army. Because if you can answer them honestly, if you can print the answers and distribute them widely, no government can survive on lies for long. Lies require darkness. Journalism is light. Rüdiger raised his hand slowly. What about military secrets? National security? What about necessary deceptions? Excellent question. Margaret faced him directly, and he noticed she had the unblinking gaze of someone who'd spent years getting people to tell her things they didn't want to reveal. In a democracy, we assume the people are smart enough to handle the truth, even uncomfortable truths, even truths that make us look bad. We publish our mistakes, we investigate our own government, we criticize our own military during wartime. Why? Because you're insane, someone suggested, earning scattered laughter. Margaret smiled. Maybe. Or maybe because sunshine is the best disinfectant. That's what one of our Supreme Court justices said. If you expose problems to public scrutiny, they tend to get fixed. If you hide them, they fester. But that's suicide, objected a former teacher from Hamburg, a man who'd taught mathematics before being conscripted. You're telling the enemy your weaknesses. You're undermining morale. You're helping the other side win, are we? Margaret pulled out her stack of newspapers, began spreading them across the desk at the front of the room. These are all recent American papers: New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle. Look at the headlines. The prisoners crowded forward, curious, despite themselves. Army admits failures in North Africa campaign. Congress questions, War Department budget overruns. Photos reveal poor conditions at Arizona internment camp. Strike at Detroit tank plant delays production. Navy captain court-martialed for negligence. These were all published in the last 3 months, Margaret said. While we're at war, while American boys are dying. Our government doesn't like these stories. The military certainly doesn't like them. But they can't stop them. Why? Because the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, isn't a gift from the government. It's a right that limits government power. Rüdiger picked up the New York Times, stared at a photograph showing crude barracks at an internment camp for Japanese Americans. The caption described poor sanitation, inadequate heating, families crammed into single rooms, an American newspaper criticizing America's treatment of its own citizens during wartime with complete freedom to do so. This would be illegal in Germany, he said quietly. Exactly, Margaret said. And that's the difference between democracy and dictatorship. Not that democracies are perfect, we're obviously not, but that we can talk about our imperfections openly. We can argue about them, we can fix them, or at least try. Over the following weeks, the class of 23 German prisoners learned to read differently, to question sources, to distinguish between reporting and propaganda, to understand that facts and narratives weren't the same thing, that the same facts could be arranged into different stories, and that which story you told mattered as much as whether the facts were accurate. They analyzed German newsreels, breaking down the techniques of manipulation, the heroic music, the carefully selected footage, the omissions. Rüdiger watched a report he'd seen 3 years earlier about a glorious victory in Russia. Footage of German tanks advancing, smiling soldiers, grateful Ukrainian villagers greeting them as liberators, and realized, with the clarity of someone learning a new language, that he was watching a defeat dressed in triumph's clothing.
Because where was the footage of what came later? Where were the images of those same tanks bogged down in mud, frozen in snow, abandoned for lack of fuel? Where were the shots of soldiers with frostbite, of supply lines that stretched 1,000 miles? Of the desperate retreat from Moscow? They weren't shown because showing them would reveal the truth, that Russia was too big, the Soviet Union too resilient, the whole campaign a catastrophic miscalculation. But you could only see this if you knew what to look for. If you understood how cameras lie by what they choose not to show. Margaret brought in American reporting on American failures. Articles about race riots in Detroit in 1943, when white workers attacked black workers hired in defense plants. About labor strikes that delayed tank production. About debates over whether Japanese-American internment was constitutional, with prominent Americans arguing both sides in public newspapers. "This is what freedom looks like," she said one December morning, the Kansas winter howling outside. Messy, argumentative, uncertain, full of people disagreeing with each other, criticizing their own government, saying things that comfort the enemy. It's chaotic and inefficient, and sometimes it seems crazy. But it's also resilient, because problems that can be discussed can be solved. Problems that must be hidden just get worse. The German prisoners divided into camps. Some rejected everything, insisted it was all elaborate American propaganda, designed to break their spirits. These men sat in the back of the classroom, arms crossed, refusing to engage. They'd wait out this nonsense, keep their faith, go home when the war ended and rebuild the Reich properly. Others converted with the zeal of the newly faithful, denouncing everything German, trying desperately to become American in thought and speech. They praised democracy as if it were a religion, spoke of the Führer as if he'd been the devil incarnate, treated their previous beliefs as sins to be confessed and expiated. Rüdiger found himself in the uncomfortable middle, unable to return to his old certainties, unwilling to simply swap one orthodoxy for another. What he was learning in Margaret Chen's classroom wasn't that America was right and Germany was wrong. It was more nuanced and more disturbing than that. He was learning that certainty itself was dangerous, that the appeal of having all the answers, of knowing absolutely that your side was right and the enemy wrong, of surrendering individual judgment to collective purpose, that this was the real poison, regardless of which flag it marched under. Democracy, as Margaret taught it, wasn't about having the right answers. It was about having a system where wrong answers could be challenged, where mistakes could be corrected, where power was temporary and accountable. It was government as an ongoing argument rather than a settled truth. This was deeply unsatisfying to men who'd been raised on certainty. But it was also, Rüdiger slowly realized, the only system that didn't eventually eat itself alive. What changed him wasn't just the teaching. It was the casual evidence all around him, day after day, month after month. The guards who treated them firmly but without cruelty, who followed rules even when breaking them would have been easier. The camp commander, a Major Bradford from Virginia, who investigated a complaint about spoiled meat in the kitchen and actually replaced the supplier, even though the prisoners had no power to enforce anything. The German-speaking American soldier, Private Joseph Schmidt, grandson of immigrants from Bavaria, who mentioned casually one day that he'd fought at Kasserine Pass, had lost his best friend there, a boy from Ohio who'd been killed by an 88mm shell from a German tank. Schmidt told this story without apparent anger, just stating facts, and then asked Rüdiger if he wanted to play chess. "Don't you hate us?" Rüdiger asked him, staring at the chessboard between them, unable to comprehend this emotional compartmentalization. Schmidt moved his knight, considered the question. "I hate what your government did. I hate that we have to fight this war. I hate that my buddy Tommy died in some shitty North African valley most Americans couldn't find on a map." He paused, looked up. "But I don't know you well enough to hate you personally. Maybe you're a good guy. Maybe you're an asshole. Either way, you're here. You're a prisoner. The war's over for you. No point holding a grudge. This distinction between the system and the individual, between hating actions and hating people, was more alien to Rüdiger than the landscape. then the food, then the language itself. In the world he'd come from, you were the system. Your personal identity dissolved into the national collective. To oppose the government was to be a traitor to the people. To question the Führer was to question Germany itself. The individual and the state were one, but here Americans argued with their government constantly and considered it patriotic. They criticized their president during wartime. They sued their own military over constitutional issues. They treated government not as a sacred entity but as a tool, useful when it worked, in need of repair when it didn't. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Rüdiger threw himself into the journalism coursework with an intensity that surprised him. He read everything Margaret assigned. He practiced writing news stories, not propaganda, but simple reporting. Who did what, when, where, why it mattered. He learned to interview people, to ask follow-up questions, to dig beneath surface answers. Margaret gave them an assignment. Interview each other about your experiences in the war. Then write a newspaper article about it. Not your own experience, someone else's. Report it objectively. Rüdiger interviewed a man named Klaus, a 30-year-old from Stuttgart who'd been a baker before the war. Klaus described being drafted in 1939, leaving behind a wife and infant daughter he'd barely known. He described the invasion of France, terrifying and exhilarating, over so fast it seemed like a dream. Then Russia, the endless Russian winter, watching men freeze to death in their foxholes, retreating through snow that came up to your waist, finally being transferred to Afrika, just in time to be captured by the British, then handed over to the Americans. "Do you regret it?" Rüdiger asked. "Would you do it again?" Klaus was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "I was proud to serve. I believed we were protecting Germany. But now, my daughter is 5 years old. I've seen her twice. My wife's last letter said Stuttgart was bombed flat. I don't know if they're alive. And for what? So we could lose anyway." Rüdiger wrote the story as objectively as he could. The facts of Klaus's service, the dates, the places, the outcome. No editorial comment, no propaganda. Just one man's experience, reported simply. Margaret gave it a B+. "Good facts, clear writing," she said. "But you're still afraid of interpretation. Journalism isn't just stenography. You need to put the individual story in context. Why does Klaus's experience matter? What does it tell us about the larger war?" Rüdiger revised it, adding paragraphs about how many German soldiers had similar stories. Millions of men separated from families, fighting in foreign countries for reasons that became increasingly unclear as the war dragged on. He included statistics, casualty numbers, countries occupied, cities destroyed. The revision felt dangerous. He was criticizing the war effort, implicitly questioning whether it had been worth the cost. In Germany, this would be defeatism, possibly treason. But this wasn't Germany. This was a classroom in Kansas where a Chinese-American woman was teaching him that asking difficult questions was not just allowed, but necessary. Margaret gave the revision an A-. "Much better," she said. "Now you're thinking like a journalist." The news of Germany's surrender reached the camp on May 8, 1945. WWII Day, victory in Europe. The war was over. The American guards celebrated with nervous relief. They were going home, or at least not getting shot at anymore. For the German prisoners, the reaction was more complex. Some cried, some sat in stunned silence. Some insisted it was Allied propaganda, that Germany was still fighting, that secret weapons would turn the tide. Rüdiger sat on his bunk in the barracks and tried to feel something. Relief that it was over. Grief for Germany's defeat. Joy at survival. Anything. Instead, there was just numbness, like the phantom sensation in his injured leg, the ghost of something that had been amputated. Over the following weeks, as more details emerged, the numbness gave way to something worse, horror. The Americans liberated the concentration camps. Photographs appeared in newspapers. Margaret brought them to class, spread them on the desk without comment. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, piles of corpses, living skeletons staring at cameras, gas chambers, crematoria, documentation of industrial-scale murder. "I didn't know," one of the prisoners said, his voice breaking. "We didn't know." "Some of you didn't," Margaret said quietly. "Some of you suspected, but didn't want to know. Some of you knew and didn't care because they weren't your people, and some of you probably participated, though none of you will admit it." The room was silent. "This is why journalism matters," she continued. "This is why free press matters. Because atrocities happen in darkness. If German newspapers had been free to investigate, to report, to ask questions, could this have been stopped? Maybe not. Power tends to find ways to hide its crimes. But maybe it could have been exposed earlier. Maybe more people would have survived." Rüdiger looked at the photographs until he couldn't anymore. He'd spent 2 years fighting for this, believing he was defending civilization, certain he was on the right side of history, and it had all been a lie, built on top of a horror so vast he couldn't process it. That night he vomited his dinner. Then he sat in the latrine building until dawn, unable to sleep, unable to think, unable to do anything but sit in the fluorescent light and try to understand how he'd been so wrong about everything. The American re-education program intensified after VE Day. With the war in Europe over, the camps shifted from holding enemy combatants to preparing them for return to a Germany that no longer existed. The prisoners watched newsreels of the camps, of German cities bombed to rubble, of the Nuremberg trials beginning. Colonel Patterson gave a lecture series on German history, tracing the path from Weimar to dictatorship. He didn't excuse or justify. He analyzed how economic crisis created desperation, how desperation made people vulnerable to authoritarian promises, how democracy, young and fragile, had been systematically dismantled through legal means before the violence began. The Enabling Act of 1933, Patterson explained, gave Hitler dictatorial powers through a vote in the Reichstag. It was legal. Democratic institutions destroyed democracy by voting to give away their own power. This is why vigilance matters, why questioning authority matters, why no one, no leader, no matter how popular, should ever be above criticism. The journalism class continued through the summer of 1945. Margaret taught them about the Weimar press, about newspapers that had tried to warn against the Nazi rise, about journalists who'd been silenced or killed. She taught them about the American muckrakers of the early 20th century. Reporters who'd exposed corruption, dangerous working conditions, child labor, political machines. "Journalism is a pain in the ass," she said, one hot July afternoon. "A good journalist is someone powerful people hate, because good journalists won't let them get away with anything. You comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. You ask rude questions at press conferences. You dig through documents. You protect your sources. You print things that make your own side look bad if they're true. But don't you love America?" one prisoner asked, genuinely confused. "Of course I do," Margaret said. "That's why I criticize it. I want it to be better." The people who really hate America are the ones who think it's already perfect and doesn't need to change. This paradox, that criticism could be an act of love, was almost impossible for the German prisoners to grasp. They'd been raised on the idea that loyalty meant unwavering support, that dissent was betrayal, that to question was to weaken. Margaret tried different approaches. "Think of it like marriage," she suggested. "If your wife burns dinner, do you pretend it's delicious? Or do you gently mention that maybe it needs less time in the oven? The first approach might seem loyal, but you'll eat burned food forever. The second approach acknowledges reality and helps improve things." "But a country isn't a marriage," someone objected. "No," Margaret agreed. "It's more important than a marriage, so it needs even more honesty. not less. By August 1945, Rüdiger had completed the journalism program. He had certificates from the U.S. Army Education Branch. He could write a news story in English and German. He understood libel law, source protection, the inverted pyramid structure, the difference between news and opinion. More importantly, he'd learned to think critically, to question authority, to demand evidence, to distinguish between what someone says and what actually happened. "What will you do?" Margaret asked him at their final class session. The war with Japan had just ended. The prisoners would be going home soon, back to a Germany that was devastated, occupied, split into zones controlled by the Allies and the Soviets. "I don't know if I have a home to go to," Rüdiger said. "Berlin was in the Soviet sector. My father was a diplomat. My family." He didn't finish the sentence. "Then you'll build a new one," Margaret said. "That's what journalism is for, really. Building new possibilities out of old ruins. Asking questions about what kind of society you want to create. Holding power accountable while it's being rebuilt." She handed him a final piece of paper, a letter of recommendation, typed on her Kansas City Star letterhead. "If you make it to the American zone, if you need work, show this to any newspaper editor. It explains what you've learned here." Rüdiger took the letter, read it, felt his eyes sting with tears he refused to shed. She'd written about his intelligence, his work ethic, his transformation from a young soldier who believed propaganda to a questioning journalist who understands democracy. "Thank you," he said, inadequate words for what he felt. "Don't thank me," Margaret said. "Just do the work. Germany needs journalists who'll tell the truth. It needed them 20 years ago. Better late than never." He returned to Germany in January 1946 on a transport ship full of repatriated prisoners. The crossing was rough. Winter in the Atlantic always was. Rüdiger spent most of it below decks, listening to men argue about what they'd find when they got home. Some planned to rebuild their lives exactly as before, find their families, return to their old jobs or farms, pretend the war had been an interruption rather than a cataclysm. Others talked about fleeing, to Argentina, to Spain, anywhere that wasn't occupied Germany. A few spoke quietly about revenge, about resistance, about not accepting defeat. Rüdiger said little. He read through his notes from the journalism course, practiced writing stories about the voyage home, interviewed his fellow passengers. He was creating an archive of experiences, of stories, of the end of one Germany and the potential beginning of another. The Germany he returned to was unrecognizable. Not just physically destroyed, though the destruction was biblical, mountains of rubble where cities had been, but psychologically hollowed out. The great certainty was gone. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and ended in apocalypse. Everyone had been so sure, so convinced, so wrong. Berlin, when he finally reached it through the Soviet zone, was a nightmare landscape. Entire neighborhoods reduced to debris. Women digging through ruins for anything salvageable. Children with hollow eyes begging for food. The smell of death still hanging in the air months after the fighting stopped. His family's apartment building in Charlottenburg was gone. Not damaged, gone, as in no longer existed, as in just a crater and scattered bricks. He searched for 3 days before finding a neighbor who told him his father had moved the family out in 1944, before the worst bombing. They'd gone to his mother's relatives in Bavaria. Bavaria was in the American zone. It took Rüdiger another week to get there, traveling through checkpoints, showing his papers, explaining over and over that yes, he'd been a prisoner. No, he wasn't trying to flee to the Soviet sector. Yes, he had permission to travel. He found them in a small village outside Munich. His mother, thinner than he remembered. His sister, now 17, who'd been 12 when he left. His father, older, grayer, but alive. They cried, they held him, They didn't ask much about the war. What was there to say? They were alive. That was victory enough. "What will you do?" his father asked after a few days, when the immediate reunion had settled into the slower work of rebuilding relationships. "Journalism," Rüdiger said. "I learned it in the camp. I'm good at it. And Germany needs—" He paused, searching for words. "Germany needs people who'll tell the truth." His father, who'd survived 2 wars, the Kaisers and Hitlers, who'd seen Germany destroy itself twice in 30 years, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. Truth would be refreshing for a change. Rüdiger found work almost immediately at the Deutsche Presseagentur, the German press agency being rebuilt in the American zone of occupation. The DPA was one of the first attempts to create a free German press modeled on wire services like Associated Press and United Press. The British and Americans were determined that the new Germany would have independent media, not a propaganda ministry. They needed people who understood journalism, who could write clearly, who could be trusted not to resurrect the old propaganda apparatus. Rüdiger's American education, his certificates from the POW camp, Margaret Chen's letter of recommendation, became credentials. In the new Germany, having been corrupted by democratic ideas was a mark of reliability. He started as a junior reporter, covering reconstruction efforts in Bavaria. How many buildings rebuilt this month? How food supplies were distributed? Which factories were reopening? The mundane details of a society trying to reassemble itself from ruins. But even mundane reporting was radical in context. Just writing objectively, stating facts without propaganda spin, was revolutionary. Just asking officials why decisions were made, questioning allocation of resources, reporting on failures as well as successes. This was democracy in action. Rüdiger worked with ferocious intensity. 18-hour days were normal. He covered refugee crises. Millions of ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, arriving with nothing, needing housing, food, jobs. He covered the beginnings of denazification, the attempt to remove from power everyone who'd held significant positions under Hitler, a process that was simultaneously necessary and impossible, because too many people had been complicit. He covered the Nuremberg trials, watching former leaders he'd believed in, revealed as war criminals. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation methodical. He watched prosecutors present papers, signed by men who claimed they didn't know about the camps, prove that they'd ordered the trains, allocated the resources, knew exactly what was happening. He wrote about all of it, objectively, clearly, without hysteria, but without evasion. This is what happened. These are the facts. These are the documents. Germany had done this. Not some abstract evil, not a small clique of fanatics, but a modern bureaucratic state that had turned murder into policy and enlisted millions in its execution. The articles made some people angry. "Why keep bringing it up?" they'd ask. "Can't we move forward?" But Rüdiger had learned from Margaret Chen that moving forward required understanding the past, that you couldn't build a healthy democracy on lies and amnesia. In 1947, he joined United Press International, becoming one of their German correspondents. This gave him access to the emerging international story, the division of Germany, the beginning of the Cold War, the Marshall Plan bringing American aid to rebuild Western Europe. He covered the Berlin blockade in 1948, the Soviets cutting off land access to West Berlin, the Allies responding with an airlift that supplied an entire city by plane for 11 months. He interviewed pilots, interviewed Berliners receiving food from the sky, interviewed Soviet officials insisting the blockade was justified. By 1950, he was heading the United Press Bureau in Bonn, the new capital of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, Democratic Germany. The Germany that had chosen, however reluctantly, however traumatized, to try democracy again. Watching this new Germany take shape was like watching an experiment in real time. Could a country that had failed at democracy, that had chosen dictatorship, that had committed atrocities,
Could such a country be trusted with freedom again? The answer slowly was yes, not because Germans had suddenly become better people, but because the system was different, because power was divided, because courts were independent, because the press was free, because all the mechanisms that had failed in Weimar, that had allowed democracy to be legally dismantled, had been strengthened. Rüdiger reported on all of it. Constitutional debates, economic recovery, the slow, painful process of Germans confronting what they'd done, what they'd allowed, what they'd refused to see. His journalism earned him a reputation, clear-eyed, fair but unsparing, willing to criticize both the new German government and the occupying powers. In 1954, he was promoted to bureau chief. In 1958, the government approached him about a different kind of work. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was expanding, and they needed people who understood both Germany and the world beyond it. People who could explain Germany to skeptical foreigners. People who'd proven they understood democratic values, not just theoretically but practically. Rüdiger was offered a position as press secretary at the German General Consulate. It meant leaving journalism, at least temporarily. It meant entering government service, becoming part of the system he'd spent a decade scrutinizing. He hesitated. Wasn't there something corrupting about going from watchdog to spokesperson? Wasn't he abandoning his principles? But he thought about what Margaret Chen had said about building new possibilities. Thought about how democracy needed good people willing to serve, not just to criticize. Thought about how he could do more to rebuild Germany's reputation, to establish trust, if he was on the inside, working professionally, rather than on the outside taking shots. He accepted. The diplomatic work used his journalism skills in unexpected ways. As press secretary, he had to communicate clearly, anticipate questions, present Germany's positions persuasively but honestly. Later, as director of the German Information Center in New York, he worked to counter lingering stereotypes, to show Americans that Germany was genuinely changing. It was delicate work. Too defensive, and you seemed like you were making excuses. Too apologetic, and you seemed weak. The balance required honesty about the past combined with evidence of genuine transformation. In 1969, Rüdiger was appointed Deputy State Secretary and Press Secretary of the Federal Republic of Germany's government. This made him one of the most visible officials in Bonn, the face and voice of German government policy. He held press conferences, briefed journalists, managed Germany's public relations during one of the most crucial periods of European politics. The 1970s were when West Germany fully established itself as a stable democracy and economic powerhouse. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, the opening to Eastern Europe, the recognition of post-war borders, the attempted détente with the Soviet bloc, required careful communication. Rüdiger helped shape that message, explaining to skeptical conservatives why engagement wasn't surrender, explaining to anxious allies why Germany could be trusted to negotiate with the East. From 1974, he became Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. This was the ultimate affirmation. The country that had started World War II, that had committed the Holocaust, was now trusted to represent democratic values at the highest levels of international governance. Rüdiger took the position seriously. He understood the irony, the near impossibility of the journey from Afrika Korps soldier to UN diplomat. He never forgot it, never let himself become comfortable enough to take it for granted. At the UN, he worked on decolonization issues, on human rights, on the slow, painful process of building international law. He saw up close how messy global governance was, how nations pursued self-interest while claiming high principles, how progress came in small increments, how easy it was to fail and how hard to succeed. But he also saw that it worked, however imperfectly. That nations could resolve disputes through words rather than weapons. That international institutions, for all their flaws, were better than the alternative of pure power politics. The culmination came in 1980. Rüdiger von Weckmar was elected president of the 35th session of the UN General Assembly.
The vote was nearly unanimous. The boy, who'd bled into North African sand at 17, who'd been saved by enemy medics, who'd learned democracy in a prisoner camp in Kansas, now presided over the Assembly of Nations. He sat at the iconic green marbled rostrum, the UN emblem behind him, 154 national delegations before him. His acceptance speech was careful. He acknowledged the uniqueness of his position. A German presiding over an organization created partly to prevent German aggression. He acknowledged the journey, the transformation, the debt owed to those who'd believed democracy could take root even in the most unlikely soil. "I stand here," he said, "as evidence that people can change, that nations can change, that the worst mistakes don't have to define us forever if we're willing to acknowledge them, learn from them, and genuinely transform." He spoke about the importance of international institutions, of laws binding on strong and weak alike, of the patient work of diplomacy. He spoke about human rights, about the Universal Declaration that recognized human dignity, regardless of nationality, and he spoke, briefly, about what had brought him here. "I learned democracy, not in a classroom in Germany, but in a prison camp in America. I learned it from a Chinese-American journalist who taught that questioning power was not treason, but responsibility. I learned it from guards who followed rules even when they could have broken them. I learned it from a system that treated enemies with the same standards it applied to its own people." The General Assembly listened in silence. Some delegates knew his history. Others were learning it for the first time. "Democracy is not easy," Rüdiger continued. "It's not natural. It requires constant work, constant vigilance, constant willingness to question ourselves. But it's the only system that allows for peaceful change, that provides mechanisms for correcting mistakes, that respects human dignity as a founding principle rather than a dispensable luxury." His term as president was consequential. He oversaw debates on Palestinian statehood, on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, on apartheid in South Africa. He navigated Cold War tensions, managed procedural disputes, kept the assembly functioning during one of the most contentious periods in UN history. It wasn't always successful. The UN couldn't solve every problem, but it provided a forum where problems could be discussed, where nations had to justify their actions, where international opinion could pressure even powerful countries to modify behavior. Rüdiger served his term, then returned to his role as Germany's permanent representative. He lived 14 years in New York total, from 1974 to 1988, becoming one of the most respected diplomats in the international community. He married a German woman named Elizabeth, whom he'd met in Bonn, a teacher who shared his commitment to education and democracy. They had 3 children, raised them in New York, taught them German and English, taught them about the past without burdening them with guilt for crimes committed before they were born. His children asked him once when they were teenagers how he'd gone from fighting for Hitler to working for democracy, how he reconciled what he'd been with, what he became. Rüdiger thought for a long time before answering. "I don't reconcile them," he said finally. "I can't erase what I was or what I believed. I was 17 and certain and completely wrong. People died because of that certainty. Maybe not directly by my hand, but I was part of the machine. That doesn't go away." "But you changed," his daughter said. "I learned," he corrected. "There's a difference. Changing suggests you just decide to be different. Learning means you were forced to confront evidence that everything you believed was wrong, and you had to build a new understanding from the ruins. It's painful. It never really ends. You don't get to feel absolved." "Then why do it?" his son asked. "Because the alternative is to stay wrong," Rüdiger said simply. "To protect your ego by refusing to admit mistakes. To keep building on a false foundation because tearing it down is too painful. That's what destroyed Germany the first time. Too many people, too invested in being right to admit they were wrong." In his later years, after retiring from diplomatic service, Rüdiger gave occasional lectures at universities. He spoke about his experiences, about transformation, about the fragility of democracy. Students would ask him the same questions journalists had asked for decades. "When did you stop believing in Nazism? When did you become a Democrat? I didn't, he'd say, and watch them look confused. Stop believing, I mean. Belief is the wrong word. I was indoctrinated, not convinced. You don't counter indoctrination with different beliefs. You counter it with thinking, with questions, with evidence. He'd tell them about Margaret Chen, about the journalism course, about learning that certainty was the problem. The scariest thing about my youth, he'd say, wasn't that I believed something evil. It's that I didn't know I was believing. It felt like truth, like knowledge, like simply seeing reality clearly. That's what ideology does. It makes itself invisible. You think you're perceiving facts when you're actually perceiving interpretation. Students would nod, but he could tell most of them didn't really understand. They'd grown up in democracies, with free press, with competing viewpoints. They couldn't imagine what it was like to live in a society where everyone said the same things, where dissent was literally impossible to imagine because you had no vocabulary for it. How do you prevent it? They'd ask. How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? You can't prevent it, Rüdiger would say. Not completely. The human desire for certainty, for belonging, for simple answers to complex problems. That's always there. The best you can do is build systems that make it harder for any one ideology to capture everything. Separation of powers, free press, independent courts, civil society, education that teaches critical thinking. And if those systems fail, then you hope you have neighbors who'll save your life even though you're their enemy, Rüdiger said. You hope there's someone like Margaret Chen, willing to teach you to think. You hope you're capable of learning even when everything you believed turns out to be a lie. He'd pause, look at the young faces staring at him, and feel the weight of history. The truth is, we're all more vulnerable to this than we think. We all want certainty. We all want to belong. We all want simple answers. The people who think they're immune to propaganda are often the most susceptible because they don't guard against it. Humility, knowing you could be wrong, is the only real defense. Rüdiger von Weckmar died on October 17, 2007 in Germany. He was 84 years old. His obituaries appeared in newspapers around the world. The New York Times, the London Times, Le Monde, papers he'd once read as a young journalism student learning his craft. They noted his distinguished diplomatic career, his role in rebuilding German-American relations, his presidency of the UN General Assembly. They mentioned his service in the Afrika Corps. You can't tell the story of transformation without acknowledging what you were transformed from. But even the best obituaries couldn't quite capture the strangeness of the journey. The sheer improbability that an American POW camp in Kansas would produce a UN president. The bizarre historical accident that the losing side of history's most destructive war would learn democracy from their captors and then teach it back to the world. There's a temptation to make this story inspirational, to frame it as redemption, as proof that anyone can change, as evidence that education overcomes indoctrination. And it is those things. But it's also darker and stranger than that simple arc suggests, because Rüdiger's transformation wasn't about becoming good instead of evil. It was about learning that certainty itself was the problem, that the seductive appeal of having all the answers, of knowing absolutely that your side was right and the enemy wrong, of surrendering individual judgment to collective purpose, that this was the real poison, regardless of which flag it marched under. The journalism program in that Kansas camp didn't teach German prisoners that America was right and Germany was wrong. It taught them that no one is entirely right, that power without accountability becomes tyranny, that the willingness to question your own government is what separates democracy from dictatorship, that blind loyalty, my country, right or wrong, is how you end up invading Poland. These lessons are harder and less satisfying than simple conversion stories. They don't offer the comfort of new certainties to replace old ones. They offer only the uncomfortable responsibility of thinking for yourself, of questioning, of living with doubt and complexity. There's one more detail worth noting, small enough that it appears in no obituary but large enough to contain everything. In 2005, 2 years before his death, Rüdiger returned to Kansas. He was 82, white-haired, moving carefully on his rebuilt leg, the one that had been shattered by shrapnel 62 years earlier, the one that still ached when storms were coming. He visited the site where the POW camp had been. Nothing remained. The barracks were long gone, the wire removed, the guard towers demolished decades ago. In their place stood a community college, its modern buildings surrounded by parking lots and athletic fields. Rüdiger walked the grounds slowly, using a cane, trying to match his memory of the camp's layout to the current configuration. Here, he thought, had been the mess hall where he'd eaten that first impossible meal of white bread and beef stew. There had been the classroom where Margaret Chen taught him that questions were more valuable than answers. A student recognized him. A young woman named Sarah, 20 years old, studying international relations. She was writing a paper on post-war German diplomacy, happened to have his photograph in her research materials. Couldn't believe he was actually there. Dr. von Weckmar. Oh my God, would you mind if I interviewed you? For my paper? He smiled, gestured to a bench. They sat in the Kansas sunshine, and she pulled out her phone to record. What would you say to young people today? She asked, her voice earnest, her questions earnest. Everything about her radiating the confidence of someone who'd grown up in a stable democracy and couldn't imagine anything else. What did you learn that matters now? Rüdiger was quiet for a long moment, looking at the college campus that had replaced his prison, thinking about all the years between then and now. I learned, he said finally, that being captured was the freest thing that ever happened to me, because it broke the certainty. And certainty is its own kind of prison, worse than wire, because you don't even know you're trapped. Sarah nodded, scribbling notes. Also, Rüdiger continued, I learned that democracy is not a gift. It's not something you achieve once and then you have it forever. It's a constant practice. You have to do it every day, questioning, arguing, correcting, improving. The moment you stop, the moment you become certain again that you have all the answers, you've already started losing it. But how do you know what's true? Sarah asked. I mean, if you're supposed to question everything, how do you know anything? You don't, Rüdiger said. Not with absolute certainty. You make provisional judgments based on evidence. You stay open to being wrong. You change your mind when new information arrives. It's uncomfortable. Humans hate uncertainty. We want firm ground, but firm ground is an illusion. Everything shifts. The best you can do is learn to keep your balance while the ground moves. Sarah looked troubled. That sounds exhausting. It is, Rüdiger agreed. Democracy is exhausting. Dictatorship is much easier. Someone else makes the decisions, someone else takes responsibility, you just follow orders. But easy isn't the same as good, and the price of easy certainty is eventually very high. They talked for another hour. Rüdiger told her about Margaret Chen, about learning journalism in the camp, about returning to a Germany that no longer existed, and helping build a new one. Sarah listened with the slightly uncomprehending attention of someone for whom all of this is history, abstract and distant, stories from another world. But she was trying. That counted for something. When they finished, Sarah thanked him, promised to send him the paper when it was done. Rüdiger stood slowly, his leg protesting, and looked one more time at the college campus. Do you have any regrets? Sarah asked as they parted. Rüdiger considered the question. Did he regret being 17 and stupid and certain? Did he regret the years spent fighting for something evil? Did he regret the men he'd killed or helped kill, the machine he'd been a part of? Yes, he said simply. Every day, but regret without learning is just narcissism. The point isn't to feel bad about yourself. The point is to do better, to help build something better. And did you build something better? Rüdiger thought about Germany, rebuilt from ruins, about democracy taking root in soil soaked with dictatorship's blood, about the UN, Flawed and frustrating, but still the best attempt at international law humanity had managed. About his children and grandchildren, growing up free, learning to think, carrying forward the project of democracy. "I tried," he said. "That's all anyone can do. Try, learn, try again. Keep trying until you die, or the world becomes slightly better. Usually both." Sarah smiled, shook his hand, walked back toward campus. Rüdiger watched her go, then turned and made his way slowly back to his car. He never saw Kansas again. 2 years later, he was dead, and the story was over. Except it's never really over. The lessons have to be relearned by each generation. The vigilance has to be maintained constantly. Democracy is never safe, never finished, never secure. All we have are stories like this one.
Stories about how people can change, how systems can change, how the worst mistakes don't have to be permanent. Stories about American medics saving enemy soldiers, about prisoner camps, where the food was adequate and the rules were followed, about teachers who believed education could transform even those who'd been thoroughly indoctrinated. Stories about white bread and beef stew changing the world. It's not much, but it's a start, and sometimes if you're very lucky, it's enough.